Welcome to Trench Diaries. This is Spitfire on My Tail Part 19. Generally, the attitude was that what the government was doing was right. The Treaty of Versailles had crippled Germany and no country would have continued under its yoke. Once strong enough, we had to overturn the clauses and, when necessary, recover what had been ours. The treaty had been punitive and we had served our sentence. Thousands had starved following the First War and the economy had been left in ruins. We had rebuilt our health and our industry, and it was time to throw off the shackles of that treaty for good. It was time to go to the rescue of the German minority and liberate the corridor and the city of Danzig. It had been obvious that some kind of fight would come with Poland and maybe also with France, but if Britain wanted to get involved, then so be it. If they came to our backyard, then they could expect a fight too. And that really was my only regret. I had never been to England, although I had been taught good English in school, but I had, during those impressionable years, been convinced that to be English would be something great. One of my teachers, Herr Wöbbelmann, had been a real Anglophile, telling us that the most wonderful thing he could conceive would be to have an English passport. Further, he had formed the opinion that they had the best developed secret service which extended its tentacles all around the world. I had thought that I would have liked to visit the English who, if the history books were to be believed, were our cousins in Europe. I would get there one day, but not perhaps in quite the way I might have planned. We of course felt disappointed to have been left out of the fighting in Poland, where one victory had followed another. But we were proud to hear on the radio and to read in the papers what a decisive role the Luftwaffe was playing in the successful advances. Acting as accurate and highly mobile artillery, the Luftwaffe was working in close liaison with the ground forces and would soon be largely responsible for the new tactical evolution later named Blitzkrieg. In the air, the Polish Air Force put up a stubborn fight and were not, as is popularly reported, knocked out on the ground. It was just that their aircraft were both inferior in design and too few to make a sustained impression on the Luftwaffe. We were still a long way from all this, but it still fell to us to do the best we could in case things went against us. I really didn't have too much respect for most of the military and administrative nonsense which had been drummed into us at Luftkriegsschule, but every now and then something of use would emerge from my memory. For example, one of the many bright minds in my Nachrichtenzug, Gefreiter Treplin, came up with the idea that we should replace the obsolete field telephone network with a more modern tannoy system with loudspeakers at the squadron dispersals. Like most innovative ideas, it was great, but where would the money come from? Here my memories of the intricacies of military administration came back as I remembered, in the case of mobilization and the resulting emergency, there would become available special funds for urgent purchases direct from the public sector. I got together with the equipment clerk and a quartermaster from the Fliegerhorst, and we discovered that there was some 30,000 marks set aside for exactly this kind of exigency. It was an enormous amount of money. My own little car had only cost 2,000 marks, and we felt more than satisfied that we had uncovered this little oasis in the supplies desert. We explained the scheme to von Pfeil, and his reaction was to be a little amused by our enthusiasm, but why not do it? He said he'd signed the papers and all looked legal. That was only the first hurdle. The rest of the course would require great initiative and determination from me and the Nachrichtenzug. Why was it always so difficult to effect change? I had to convince so many people of the existence of the fund and of the emergency, then acquire the newly introduced purchase orders from innumerable different public offices, and last, but by no means least, we had to actually track down the equipment that we needed. At the core of the system would be a powerful amplifier, a massive multi-valved powerhouse which had multiple inlet and outlet sockets. Then we bought literally miles of heavy-gauge copper wire because our own telephone wires were too thin and would have offered too much resistance to transmit a powerful signal to the speakers. Then there were the speakers and the mounting poles, and soon we had enough to start. The clever young Gefreiter Treplin had even had the foresight to include a record player in this shopping list, which would add the last, really professional touch to what we were doing. It took about a week to complete what we had planned, and we really didn't want to commission it until we were satisfied with the results. There were now speakers at all crucial points on the airfield, at each squadron's dispersal, adjacent to the hangars, and even one close to our own Gefechtsstand, which was the mobile battle headquarters or ops room, so that we could monitor what alarm we might be spreading. We hadn't raised any enthusiasm for the scheme when we first started, but now, when it was operational, it was received with great acclaim. The benefits were more than we had expected, and it added greatly to the quality of life of the Gruppe. If you wanted to contact someone, you could just pull a call out for him with a number to respond to, no more endless telephoning around the dispersals and hangars. When, later on, one of these squadrons was scrambled, the others wouldn't have to ring in to see what was happening, they would have heard the message as well. Probably best of all, due to the foresight of Treplin, we could play music all day and even hook in the radio for up-to-date news broadcasts. This really helped, we were told, when the pilots had to sit around in the famous deck chairs and cast-off armchairs waiting for the scramble. The only problem was that you couldn't appeal to all tastes all the time, and sometimes we had to consider disconnecting the field telephones because of the constant stream of requests for favorite tunes. Our conditions at war were quite good, but not as good as we had enjoyed at Böblingen. There was a canteen which served good, if rather plain food, we had an officers' mess as did the NCOs, and sleeping accommodation was in the form of some Nissen huts. Our Gefechtsstand was situated in a corner of the field where some cover was provided by birch trees and camouflaged netting. About 300 meters away lay the entrance to the monastery of St. Augustine. The monks were very interested in our activities and were quite open to us in return. It was the first time I had seen the real heart of a monastery, and in particular the individual cells. I could see at first hand what a Spartan life was really like. We might have felt deprived in our field conditions, but compared with these hardy monks, we lived in a decadent luxury. We had just about settled down when a new unit appeared, 10th Group of Jagdgeschwader 26. They called themselves Nachtjäger, or Night Fighters, and were equipped with the older 109 Doras. Because of the difficulty of night takeoffs and landings, they had been allocated the Doras in preference to the Emils because of their comparative stability. The squadron leader, Oberleutnant Johannes Steinhoff, was apparently a good friend of Kühle's, even though he had not been to Spain. Our own squadron leaders seemed to talk about Steinhoff with pity, saying that he'd been crazy enough to invent the idea of night flying, and then went on to form the first Nachtjägerstaffel. Our people thought that the whole idea was ridiculous and were obviously glad that there was only one squadron operational. The idea that air warfare could, and would in the future, continue after dark was beyond their imagination. It was another example of the short-sightedness of some of the officers. I was interested in what they were doing and saw that good communications could be of value to them at night. So when they flew their night exercises, I tried to communicate with them, but on the whole, they seemed shy of the radio. I did succeed in exchanging a few sentences with Steinhoff himself, but they didn't seem to want to try it. Maybe they had already heard enough funny remarks about their enterprise without getting involved with another faction which had already been labeled lunatic. I thought they could have done with all the help they could get, their flying being to us nothing less than a nightmare. Whenever they had to scramble, and at that time they got more than us, or even then they were practicing, they had no lights on the aerodrome at all. Nothing to mark the runway but two of their own staff cars with the headlights on. No direction finding equipment and no special radio. It was remarkable that there were not more accidents. Their goal was to try to get some coordination between the huge searchlights which were based with the flag batteries around the Ruhr. I tried to establish if they had any plans to use direction finding radio or any navigational devices and found that there were none. I was interested in this particular idea and could see that it might have great potential for the night fighters, but I couldn't make any progress. Later, when we left Hangela, the idea dropped. For our own interest, we tried to develop the idea of direction finding by radio. Unteroffizier Krehe, my resident joker, had made firm contact with the airfield's direction finding Feldwebel on his own initiative. They talked a lot and involved more of the Nachrichtenzug who had been radio hams, and after some time a possible method by which my idea of being able to give bearings for fighters came to light. Initially, everybody thought that the shortwave transmission would offer no solution, but together we developed the first crude method. By using feedback, we could generate an oscillating signal that would produce an audible whistle on which we could take a bearing. This would be sent out from my aircraft, and because the source was known, the ground station could judge my range and bearing relative to them. I had told von Pfeil what we were doing, and he approved our continued research. First, I tested the method in good weather, high clouds and good visibility, but having my approach directed from the ground and only verifying my course visually. It was a far from simple method. Unteroffizier Krehe was seated next to the man who was taking the readings on the direction finding equipment, which was located some 2 kilometers from the Gefechtsstand and the main transmitter. Krehe would talk by field telephone to our radio operator in the Gefechtsstand, who would be in radio contact with me. He would tell me when to press the button in my aircraft so that they could take a bearing and have this fed back to me by the ground station. I could then set my compass and fly on. Because there were two communications links, the direction-finding equipment to ground station by telephone and the ground-to-air communication by radio, it was a little complicated, but nonetheless, it worked. By keeping a steady speed on the approach, we could easily calculate when I was overhead of the airfield. Our initial trials had been done with me flying at 2000 meters and later under more realistic conditions with a heavy cloud layer with a base at about 1000 meters. Just as we felt that we were making progress, I had the order from von Feil to stop. Apparently, our neighboring fighter units had been complaining about the whistling on air and our shortwave conversations. He was sorry, but that would have to be an end to it. Again, I have to observe that the lack of foresight on the part of the Luftwaffe in general was appalling. Very early on, we could have saved many crews and aircraft if we had been able to talk to them instead of letting them fly around in fog or cloud until they ran out of fuel. For instance, over Dunkirk, our whole first squadron later became lost with every aircraft being damaged in emergency landings in the fields of Belgium. If we had been able to continue our experiments, we would surely have refined our technique by then and have been of valuable assistance then and on numerous other occasions. On a brighter note, our loudspeaker network at Hangela was being heralded as a great success. Word of it even got to General Martini, whom I had previously met when struggling to establish our Nachrichtenzug. We were ordered to leave everything installed at Hangela when we left and were assured that all Heimatjagdfliegerhorsten, which were the fighter bases on German soil, would have similar systems installed as standard, using ours as a template. Further, wherever we were to be moved to next would have a system installed by the base Luftnachrichtengruppe ready for us. No more emergency purchases and endless trailing around government offices for chits to buy equipment. We couldn't believe it. We had actually made a dent in the otherwise unyielding and entrenched views of high command. In fact, it was a little too much to hope for. Some systems were built in, but all too quickly the emergency mobilization funds ran out and the work stopped. At this point, I think it is crucial to talk about one of the most valuable parts of my own personal record of the war, which is a collection of some 50 letters which I wrote to my mother at the time. They are a perfect record of how things were, encapsulating the feelings and events of the time in a way that is not subject to the vagaries of memory or the ravages of time. From here on, I will quote from this source, hoping that the accurate feelings of those heady days will come across. September the 4th, 1939. We are stationed here to protect the Ruhrgebiet, and nothing happens. We are afraid that the French and the English will withdraw before we get a chance to fight. There is a little time for writing. I get up at about 4 AM and our readiness lasts until 8 PM. With father also gone, how do you feel? Can my car stay in the barn? Should the war last much longer, can you please see to it that it is raised to relieve the springs and have the petrol taken out? A parcel with dirty laundry will leave here the day after tomorrow. September the 9th, 1939. Probably the Feldpost doesn't work, no answer yet. Every day an aircraft flies from Bonn to Böblingen and back, therefore please send your letters there, which is the old address. From 0500 we are sitting around. The weather is beautiful, again there's dirty laundry. Some JUW-34 takes off at 10 AM for Böblingen, nothing to be seen of the war, probably father is closer to the events. At the moment there are reports about AA guns firing near to Karlsruhe and Baden-Baden. It looks like the war in Poland will be over in 14 days. I have encased 100 marks. Please take them to the Sparkasse. September the 24th, 1939. Nothing new. No contact with the enemy. It seems better at Wiesbaden and Mannheim. They have recorded victories there. Böblingen and Eutingen have one each. Our life is similar to Straubing, with the difference that there is much more for me to do. My job has great responsibility. Der Gefechtsstand is my duty exclusively. However, 8 days ago a reserve officer, Oberleutnant Förster, arrived and he takes over when all of the Gruppe is in the air, including myself. Now I am with the staff flight. I have my own aircraft, which I had to fetch myself from Erding near Munich. On that trip I stopped at Böblingen twice, the first time because I couldn't reach Munich with the Alp closed in with cloud. Both times I stayed with the Deutschles in Bad Cannstatt to see Gretel. We lead a sorry life, waiting is probably worse than war. I hope that there will soon be a decision. I didn't feel too much on my birthday, which is September the 14th, my 21st, but considering there's a war, that isn't important. On the day after, many packages arrived. Thank you very much for your kind letter. In my letters, I mentioned quite casually that I had been unable to reach Munich because of the low cloud of the Schwäbische Alb, which is south of Stuttgart. There was actually much more to this. It was to be one of the most potentially dangerous situations that I had ever experienced. I had set off with an Unteroffizier from the staff company to collect some new parachutes from the supply depot at Erding and to bring back my own Emil. He had volunteered because he wanted to visit relations near there and I because I wanted the chance to stop at Böblingen. On the outward leg, we had only been cleared to fly our Junkers W-34 as far as Böblingen and to get fresh weather report there. They told us that the clouds were shrouding the tops of the hills at 800 meters, but that later there might be a weather window which would allow us to fly through, crossing the Danube near Ulm. We were impatient, and as the weathermen were my old friends from the time when we'd been based at Böblingen, they said that we could try anyway. So we took off and followed the Stuttgart-Munich Autobahn as it led up the Alp. The road was only open on one carriageway at the time. It followed a steady slope up towards a narrow pass in the Alp known as the Drachensteiner Hang. This led up to the rather dramatic pass over the Alp and is fenced in tightly on both sides by steep unyielding rocks, escarpments and forest. We carried on climbing in the lumbering old W-34, keeping the road on our right, and all too soon it became obvious that we were heading for trouble. Up ahead, the Autobahn just slid quietly up into the ceiling of cloud, and we would have to follow. The old W-34 was not built for flashy aerobatic turns, and so there was no way that we could wheel around in the steadily rising and narrowing confines of the Drachensteiner Hang. Coupled with this was the fact that neither myself or the Unteroffizier had flown the W-34 much since training time. I felt that terrible knotting in the stomach as I began to realize that what was ahead was potentially lethal and there was no way it could be avoided. We plunged into the heavy cloud and the Junkers began to be shaken about like a leaf in a gale. We both stared fixedly at the instruments, but to no avail. The artificial horizon was being thrown from side to side by the violence of the gyrations, and the airspeed dropped back to a very dangerous 120 km per hour. The throttle was slammed forwards, but we dare not drop the nose too much for fear of crashing into the steeply rising ground which we knew to be below. Still, the instruments made no sense. As suddenly as the indicated airspeed had dropped to 120 km, it now leapt forwards to register 300. Impossible for our plump old lady. There's nothing quite like the fear that this kind of experience can generate. If you've never flown into conditions like this, it can only be related, perhaps to driving a car which is only moving 2 dimensions into a wall of freezing fog when the car is on ice. The difference is that in the car you gradually slow and hope that you don't hit anything before you stop. In seconds, the experience is stabilized again. But in an aircraft, that terrifying tension, feeling that a sheer rock wall might only be a few meters in front of your aircraft, or that you might already be driving towards the ground, can last for many minutes and can be completely overwhelming. There's only one certainty: if you panic, you're dead. For a full 5 minutes we were tossed around in that aircraft, not daring even to look at each other, desperately trying to regain control before we and our aircraft became so much scattered wreckage littering the beautiful Alp. Luck must have been with one of us, for after what had seemed like hours of tension, the aircraft exploded from the cloud base in a high speed and at an impossible steep turning angle. That was easily corrected now that we were back in visual contact with the ground, and we quickly retrimmed the Junkers for level flight and breathed a hearty sigh of relief. How we had escaped, I don't know to this day. Every time I drive over the pass now, I wonder how we missed the sheer rock cliffs and the tall pines that form the Schwäbische Alb. But we did, and found ourselves flying over Kirchheim, a little town very well known to me. Needless to say, we flew back to Böblingen to wait for clearer weather. Once more I had impetuously pitted myself against what common sense dictated, but again I had survived. We stayed overnight and set out the next day with the trip going much more to plan. At Erding, the Unteroffizier stayed overnight again, whilst I returned with my 109 that evening as far as Böblingen and then flew the Bonn leg the next day. These flights were less eventful than our first attempt to reach Erding. When I look back through my letters home, I am amazed that there is no reference to the war with Poland. Not even of the more significant events like the bombing of Warsaw, which took place on or near to the 17th of September. It couldn't have been because of any military restrictions on what I could write, because I seem to have passed on much information about our operations and location without any fear of censorship. What I do remember is my strong impressions regarding Russia entering into the Polish campaign as they did on the 17th. I was very sad and, to a degree, angered by the fact that they had just come along to share the booty. The battle itself had been won without their help, and now they just rode in against virtually no opposition to take over half of the country. I had never liked the idea that we should be allied in any way to the Bolsheviks, and this had done nothing to change my mind. At our front, there was little to report. My letters read: October 5th, 1939. Still, nothing new. We are flying around all day long, sometimes very close to the border, without any contacts. We search the horizon without result, and so far there is no victory for our Gruppe. However, things might change. Hitler will speak tomorrow. I don't think that England will agree to peace and the war will really get started now. Don't worry about me. October the 7th, 1939. Now, here's finally a reason to write. You must have heard on the radio, our Gruppe brought down 2 French aircraft yesterday. As we sat at the Gefechtsstand listening to the Führer's speech, there were some Fluko warnings from Trier. As this was outside our area, I didn't order takeoff yet. We continued listening, and for one moment I thought I'd heard engine noises, but at the same moment a column of motorized vehicles passed, but I still thought I'd heard aero engines to the south of our field. No reports came in. In spite of this, I had 2 red flares fired up. These were still required by Luftwaffe operations instructions in spite of the tannoy system which we had operating. And within no time 2 109s were in the air. As there were several layers of cloud, we could see nothing. Then we got flag reports from Siegburg and Godesberg. I sent up a few more aircraft. Altogether, there were 11 aircraft airborne. Then we saw a Potel 63 and by radio directions I guided our aircraft as much as possible. The AA guns were firing at the same time without results, but the black smoke puffs from their shell burst showed clearly the progress of the aircraft, which was hopping from one cloud layer to another. We had aircraft between each layer, and soon one of the French machines was shot at by one of the Oberfeldwebel and the crew took to their parachutes. The other was trying to escape at low level but was caught by Lieutenant Bertel and shot down at 10 meters altitude. It skidded on its belly and the crew were wounded by the machine gun fire and taken prisoner. In 20 minutes it was all over and we fell about each other's necks and jumped for joy. The ice had been broken. You keep asking why I write so rarely, but Father, what shall I report when nothing is happening? When our commander returns, he has been gone for 2 days, but I think he'll be happy when hearing that we now have 2 victories. October the 10th, 1939. On the public radio, you will now have heard more about our 2 victories as there has been much drama about this. I am also sending a newspaper clipping. I have to laugh about it because the commander was in Berlin on this day and I had to handle the Gefechtsstand. However, I feel inside that part of this success was mine. It was me who gave the orders to take off and the directions by the transmitter. Most important now, I will now fly with the 3rd Squadron. The plotting and all other associated activities I am now turning over to a most reasonable reserve Oberleutnant Förster, who has now had 14 days instruction from me. My Nachrichtenzug will be kept in trim in the meantime by myself. Whether there will be more fighting now, nobody knows, but I am burning for action now that I am in a position to be able to pull the trigger myself. I don't know anything further, I live well or as much as it is possible and tell everybody how proud I am of our family. That is, with all 4 members servicing, mother teaching at school, Trude working with the Telex and both father and son as soldiers. Isn't that great? October the 16th, 1939. Only very short message today. Soon I shall be on alert. Last night I was duty officer and last Friday Lieutenant Kirchner had a victory. I had taken off as well with my squadron leader, but I was too late. I really don't like this waiting. You see, things didn't change too much in the following 2 or so weeks. There was a steady exchange of information with my parents, but nothing which I see as interesting or illustrative of the time. I note that we kept up the exchange of laundry and that my mother was solely in need of my military soap ration for this purpose. The war is slowly catching up with Uli, while he is still fighting against bureaucracy. But, most importantly, he got to meet Johannes Steinhoff. Steinhoff is one of the most well-known and successful German pilots of World War II, claiming 176 air victories. He would join the Federal Armed Forces of Germany after the war, becoming a general and was majorly responsible for creating the new Luftwaffe. His last posting was chairman of the NATO Military Committee, a committee that throughout its existence was chaired, among others, by such illustrious persons as Omar Bradley and Lord Mountbatten. Steinhoff died in 1994, not far from where I am living right now. The premier Eurofighter training squadron in Germany, the Tactical Fighter Squadron 73 based near Rostock in the northeast of Germany, is named in his honor. As for Uli, we will see how the war will play out for him in the next episode. Cheers.